The day my entire world fell apart, I was wearing a blazer I'd ironed twice because I wanted to look put together for the drive home. It was the Friday before Labor Day weekend, and I remember thinking the timing was perfect. 3 days off. Maybe my parents and I could finally have a normal conversation. Maybe my mother would make her cornbread stuffing even though it wasn't Thanksgiving. Maybe my father would ask me about my job without immediately turning it into a lecture about why I should have gone to law school instead. I'm a social worker. I've been one for 4 years. I work with foster children in the county system, and I go home most nights feeling like I've done something that matters. My father has never once said he was proud of that. I was 40 minutes outside of Dayton when the semi crossed into my lane. I don't remember the impact. I remember the sound, this horrible, grinding shriek of metal, and then I remember waking up with a plastic oxygen mask over my face and a woman in scrubs leaning over me saying my name. My name is Donna. She kept saying it. Donna. Donna. Stay with me. My left arm was broken in 2 places, 3 ribs. A laceration across my collarbone that needed 14 stitches. They told me later I was lucky the airbag deployed the way it did. Lucky. I've turned that word over in my mind 100 times since. The ER nurse, her name tag said Philippa, she asked me if there was someone she should call. I gave her my parents' number. They live 45 minutes from that hospital. I know because I've made that drive my whole life. Philippa came back 20 minutes later. She had a look on her face I couldn't quite read. She told me my parents said they'd come as soon as they could, that my father had an early tea time the next morning, and they'd drive up after. I thought I'd misheard her. She repeated it gently, like she was breaking news. They said they'd try to get there tomorrow afternoon. I was lying in a hospital bed with a broken arm and fractured ribs, and my parents were going to finish their weekend plans first. I didn't cry. I think I was too shocked to cry. I just stared at the fluorescent light above me and thought about how cold the room was, and how the machine next to me kept beeping, and how no one was coming. My father called me the next morning. Not to check in, not to ask how I was. He called to tell me that my car, a 2019 Civic I'd bought with my own money and paid off 2 years early, was probably totaled, and that I should make sure I documented everything properly for the insurance claim. Because last time my cousin had a fender bender, they tried to underpay her. That was the whole call, 4 minutes and 30 seconds. I know because I looked at my phone after and stared at that number for a long time. My mother called an hour after that. She asked if I was comfortable. She asked if the nurses were nice. Then she told me my father's back had been acting up and the drive might be hard on him, so they were thinking Sunday morning instead. I told her I was being discharged Saturday afternoon. She said, "Oh, well, that works out then." I hung up and I looked out the window at the parking lot below and I made a decision right then. I didn't know exactly what the decision was yet, but something in me went very quiet, the way things go quiet right before they break. What I haven't told you yet, what I need to back up and explain because it matters, is that I grew up in a house where my parents' approval was the weather. You never knew what you were going to get. Sunny. When my father was in a good mood and had been drinking just enough scotch. Cold front, when my grades weren't high enough, when I chose the wrong college major, when I came home for Christmas and told them I was taking a pay cut to move into a more demanding caseload because I believed in the work. My father's name is Bernard. He retired early from a career in commercial real estate and has very strong opinions about what constitutes a worthwhile life. Spoiler, social work doesn't make the list. My mother's name is Wanda. She was a school librarian for 30 years, and she is, genuinely, one of the warmest people I have ever met. When my father isn't in the room. When he is, she becomes someone else. Smaller. She agrees with things I've seen her privately disagree with. She laughs at things that aren't funny. I used to think I could reach her if I just found the right moment. I spent most of my 20s looking for that moment. What I also need to tell you about is my Aunt Roberta. My father's older sister. She came to every birthday party I had until I was 11, and then she didn't. And the explanation I was given was that she and my father had a falling out over money, and it was none of my business. When I was in high school and asked my mother about it, she said the same thing. None of your business, Donna. Aunt Roberta had sent me a card every single birthday, every Christmas, every graduation, always with a handwritten note. Always warm, always asking about my life in the kind of specific way that told me she was paying attention somehow. She knew I'd switched from pre-law to social work. She knew I'd gotten the county job. She never explained how she knew these things. My father returned every gift she sent before I was 18. I found that out when I was 23, at my college roommate's kitchen table, crying after a particularly brutal holiday visit. And my roommate asked me why I'd never just reached out to this aunt who clearly loved me. I hadn't known. That's the honest answer. I hadn't known there were gifts to return. By the time I understood what my father had been doing, I felt so much shame that I didn't know how to start. Where do you begin? Sorry, my father sent back 10 years of birthday presents. I didn't know. Please don't be a stranger. I wrote her 3 letters I never sent. I have them in a shoebox under my bed. After the hospital discharged me, a colleague from work drove 2 hours to pick me up because I had no one else to call. Her name is Faye, and she brought me a gas station coffee and a blanket she'd had in her trunk, and she didn't make me talk. I sat in her passenger seat with my arm in a sling and watched Ohio go by and felt something I can only describe as a grief I didn't have a name for yet. My parents came to see me 8 days after the accident. They brought a casserole my mother had made and a card my father had signed with just his name. No love. No, we were so worried. Just Bernard. We sat in my apartment, and my mother fussed with the casserole dish, and my father looked around at my furniture like he was appraising it. And then he told me he'd done some research and found a good personal injury attorney if I wanted to go after the trucking company. That was the visit. An hour and 15 minutes. He talked about the lawsuit potential for most of it. When they left, my mother hugged me carefully around my sling and whispered, "You know your father." Like that explained everything. Like your father was an apology, an absolution, a reason. I didn't hear from them much after that for a while. I was healing, going to physical therapy twice a week, doing video sessions with my caseload from my couch. The hospital bill came in October. I want to be precise here because people always ask. The total was $41,000. My insurance covered most of it. My out-of-pocket responsibility, after everything, was $6,200. I had just over $4,000 in savings at that point because I'd been paying back a loan. I need to tell you about the loan. When I was a senior in college, I was short on tuition for my final semester. Roughly $3,200. My father offered to cover it. He said it was a gift. I thanked him. I graduated, got my MSW, started working. When I was 25, my father sat me down during a holiday visit and told me I owed him $3,200. That the money had been a loan, not a gift, and that he'd been patient, but it was time to settle up. I didn't have documentation either way. It was my word against his. And in that family, my word had never counted for much. I'd been paying him back $150 a month for almost 2 years by the time I was in that accident. I had paid back over $3,000 of it. And somehow the principal never seemed to shrink. So when the hospital bill came, I had $4,000 in savings and a $6,000 bill and a broken arm that kept me from working my full hours. And I sat at my kitchen table and genuinely did not know what I was going to do. Then I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. A Cincinnati area code. I almost didn't answer it. It was a woman who identified herself as an employee of a law firm. She asked if I was Donna and confirmed my address, and then she told me my hospital balance had been paid in full, and that there was a package being sent to my address that I should expect within the week. She said the package was not to be opened until I received a follow-up call. I asked who had paid it. She said she wasn't authorized to say, but that I would understand when I received the call. I spent the next 6 days in a state of low-grade bewilderment. Faith thought it was some kind of scam. I'd checked my hospital portal and the balance was genuinely zeroed out, so whatever it wasn't a scam. My mother, when I mentioned it, said that was very strange and maybe I should call the hospital to make sure. My father said I should still pursue the trucking company lawsuit because $6,000 was nothing compared to what I could get. He did not ask who might have cared enough about me to pay $6,000. That absence of curiosity told me everything. The package arrived on a Tuesday. Brown paper, my name handwritten in a loopy cursive I didn't recognize. Inside was a smaller box, gift wrapped in silver paper, with a small envelope taped to the top marked "Not Yet." I put it on my kitchen counter and stared at it for 3 days. The follow-up call came on a Thursday evening. Same woman from the law firm. She told me I could open the package now, and that the firm would be in touch within 2 weeks regarding some additional matters. I asked her again who had sent it. She paused, and then she said, "Your father's sister. She asked me to tell you she's been watching out for you for a long time and she's sorry it took this form." I had to sit down. I opened the package on the floor of my kitchen, still in my work clothes. Inside the silver wrapping was a small wooden box, the kind with a brass latch. And inside that box was a letter in that same loopy cursive, a photograph, and a key. The letter was 4 pages, handwritten on pale yellow paper. She told me she'd hired a small service years ago just to keep track of the basics. Not invasive, she said, just enough to know I was okay. She knew about my job. She knew about the accident. She knew about the loan and what my father had called it after the fact, because my mother, my quiet, agreeable mother, had called her in secret twice over the years. Partly out of guilt, and partly, I think, because she needed someone to witness what was happening. Aunt Roberta told me she'd wanted to reach out directly many times. She wrote that she'd actually driven to my apartment complex once, 2 years after I graduated, and sat in the parking lot for 40 minutes trying to decide whether to knock. She was afraid, she said, that I'd reject her the way my father had trained me to, that I'd see her as the villain in the story he'd told. She was afraid of making my situation with him worse. She wrote, "I convinced myself that staying away was the right thing for you, and now I think I was also protecting myself from a door that might not open. And I'm sorry for that. You deserved better than a woman sitting in a parking lot." The photograph was of her holding me at what looked like my 3rd or 4th birthday party. I'm wearing a purple dress I have absolutely no memory of. But my face in that picture, I look so happy. She looks happy too. The key was to a property she owned in Indiana, about an hour and a half from where I live. A small house with a studio space she'd built in the backyard when she was still doing pottery. She'd written a separate note about it, practical things, the address, utilities, the neighbor who had a spare key and watered the plants. The legal letter came 12 days later. Aunt Roberta had been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's 2 years prior. She wasn't dying, the letter was careful to say, but she was restructuring her affairs. She was placing the Indiana property in my name. She was also, the letter said, prepared to provide documentation, which she had in her possession, regarding financial transactions my father had represented as gifts to family members over the years, which he had later attempted to reclassify as debts. The documentation included correspondence. The lawyer noted with professional detachment that this documentation might be of interest to me should I ever wish to pursue the matter. I read that paragraph 4 times. I called Faye and read it to her over the phone. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Donna, she's handing you the receipts." I did not call my parents. I sat with it for 2 weeks, and then I called the law firm and spoke to the attorney directly, a woman named Ms. Whitfield, who had clearly dealt with situations like mine before. She explained what Aunt Roberta had put together, why it was credible, what my options were. She did not push me toward any particular decision. She laid out the road clearly and let me decide which direction to walk. I want to tell you what I decided. But first I want to tell you about Thanksgiving, because it happened in between. My parents called in early November, and my father told me they were doing a small gathering, just the 4 of us and my cousin Ethan, and that it would be good for everyone to get together. He said this in the tone he used when something was not actually optional. I drove to their house in Kettering. I brought a sweet potato casserole because I knew my mother liked it, and I was trying to do the thing I always do, which is smooth things over, show up, be the person who keeps the peace. At dinner, my father said in front of my cousin that he hoped my accident had made me think seriously about getting a more stable job. He said social work was noble but impractical. He said I was 31 and it was time to think about retirement accounts and buying property and building something real. I put down my fork. I told him, very calmly, that I had actually just received a property in Indiana. He stared at me. I told him it came from Aunt Roberta. My mother made a sound like she'd been startled. My father went very still in that way. He does right before he says something that is designed to end the conversation. He said, "Roberta is not a stable person. Whatever she sent you, whatever she's told you, you need to consider the source." I said, "She paid my hospital bill." He said, "Why would she do that?" I said, "Because she knew you didn't." The table was completely quiet. Ethan was very interested in his sweet potato casserole. My mother said my name in a warning tone, and I thought about all the times I'd heard my name in that tone, all the times I backed down from the edge because it was easier, because I wanted to be loved, because I kept thinking there was a version of this family that was still recoverable. I said, "The money you call my loan, the $3,200 from my last semester of college, that you originally told me was a gift, I'd like to discuss that." My father said, "This is not the time or place." I said, "I have documentation that suggests it was always described as a gift. I also have documentation of every payment I've made. I'd like to resolve it properly, or I'll resolve it through other channels." He told me I was being dramatic. He told me Roberta had always tried to cause trouble in this family. He told me I was embarrassing myself. I stood up, said thank you to my mother for the meal, said goodbye to Ethan, put on my coat, and left. I drove home with my heart hammering and the radio off, and I pulled into my parking lot and just sat in the car for a while, breathing. I thought about the woman in the photograph holding a small girl in a purple dress. I thought about a parking lot in Cincinnati, and 40 minutes of almost. I thought about Philippa the ER nurse saying my name in the dark, and my parents deciding their weekend plans could wait. I called Aunt Roberta 2 days later. I had her number from the law firm paperwork and I stared at it for an hour before I dialed. When she picked up, I didn't know what to say, so I just said, "This is Donna, your niece." She didn't say anything for a second, and then she said, "I know who you are, sweetheart." She said it like she'd been waiting. Not impatiently. Just waiting. We talked for almost 2 hours. We've talked almost every week since. She is funny in a dry way I didn't expect. She asks real questions and then actually listens to the answers. She told me about her pottery, her dog, the neighbor with the plants, a book club she runs at the library 2 towns over. She cried twice during that first call, briefly, and apologized both times, and I told her she didn't have to apologize, and I meant it. She is the family I thought I was driving toward that Friday before Labor Day. As for the loan, I did pursue it through proper channels. Ms. Whitfield filed the appropriate documentation. I am not going to drag out the details here because honestly that part of it isn't the story I want you to take away from this. What I'll say is that the matter was resolved, and I no longer owe my father a single dollar, and I have not spoken to him since Thanksgiving. My mother has called twice. The first time, she wanted to tell me my father's feelings were hurt. The second time, this was 3 months later, she called at 7 in the morning and she was crying and she said she was sorry. She said she knew that wasn't enough. She said she needed more time to figure out what to do with that, and I told her I understood, because I do. I don't know what happens next with her. I'm holding that door open and not holding my breath. What I know is this: I drove to the Indiana property in February, on a Saturday when the sky was that specific pale winter blue that makes everything look clean. Aunt Roberta had driven up to meet me. The house is small. 2 bedrooms, wood floors, a porch that looks out over a field. The studio in the backyard has a skylight she put in herself and shelves along every wall still holding her old work. We had lunch at the kitchen table she'd left there, soup she'd made and brought in a thermos, and we talked about what I might do with the space. She suggested I could use the studio for whatever I wanted. I don't do pottery. I told her I used to paint, in college, before I told myself there wasn't time. She said, "There's time now." I've been going out on weekends when I can. I've been painting again. Last month I drove out with Faye, and we stayed 2 nights, and I made her let me paint her portrait, which she agreed to on the condition that I made her look like a French movie star. I did my best. I've also been thinking about the kids on my caseload, specifically the ones aging out of the system, the ones who turn 18 and suddenly have nowhere to anchor. I've been talking to Ms. Whitfield about setting up a small fund. Nothing massive. Just something with Aunt Roberta's name on it, something that says, someone was watching out for you even when you didn't know. I'm 31 years old. I have a broken arm that healed slightly crooked, a house in Indiana, an aunt who calls every Tuesday, a colleague who drove 2 hours without being asked, and a studio with a skylight that fills with gold light on Sunday mornings. I also have a shoebox under my bed with 3 unsent letters in it. I think it's time to throw them away. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened. Not in a mystical way. I'm not someone who believes the universe is keeping score or that suffering is handed out as punishment for past wrongs. But I do believe that what people choose to do consistently over years eventually becomes what defines them, and what they fail to do does too. My father made a series of choices. He chose to return gifts. He chose to reframe a gift as a loan. He chose to stay home the night his daughter woke up alone in an emergency room. None of those were accidents or oversights. They were decisions made deliberately, and they accumulated into something that couldn't be undone with a casserole and a card signed with just his name. Aunt Roberta also made choices. She made the wrong ones sometimes. She sat in a parking lot for 40 minutes and drove away, and I think she'll carry that longer than I'll hold it against her. But she kept showing up in the ways she could. She kept the door open from her side, even when she had no way of knowing if I'd ever walk through it. That consistency, quiet and unseen, turned out to matter more than anything dramatic she could have done. What I've learned, and I mean actually learned, not just intellectually understood, is that integrity isn't really about the big moments, it's about the small, invisible ones. The birthday card sent to a niece who doesn't know it's coming. The colleague who puts a blanket in her trunk before a 2-hour drive because it might be cold. The choice to tell the truth about a loan versus the easier choice of letting someone believe it was a gift. I used to think the goal was to be resilient, to absorb whatever came at me, and keep moving and not complain too loudly. I spent a lot of years thinking that was strength. I know now that it wasn't strength. It was just endurance. And endurance without direction isn't the same thing as building a life. Real strength, I think, is the willingness to look clearly at what is actually in front of you and make a different choice. To stop smoothing things over when smoothing them over has never once made them better. The hardest part wasn't the confrontation at Thanksgiving. It wasn't the legal process, or not talking to my father, or sitting with the uncertainty of what my mother will decide to do. The hardest part was accepting that I had spent years being the person who kept showing up, hoping that love would eventually look the way I needed it to, when the truth was, it simply wasn't there in the form I was looking for. Accepting that is not the same as giving up on people. It's just being honest about what you're working with. I'm 31. I have a studio with a skylight. I have an aunt who says I know who you are, sweetheart, like she's been waiting years to say it out loud. I have 3 unsent letters in a shoebox that I haven't thrown away yet, but probably will, because I don't need them anymore. The person I wrote them to already knows. That's enough. It turns out that's quite a lot.